Okay, so I'm very happy to welcome Kristy Beers Fägersten. I'm trying to do my best Swedish, which is obviously my vowels are terrible. Who's a professor at more practice for student vowels, Södertörn University in Stockholm. And she's been there, I guess, for a few years.
Yeah, since 2010.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a really recognized authority on swearing, and on a whole bunch of other things in pragmatics, sociolinguistics, multimodal discourse, conversational analysis, things like that. And she has a lot of interesting projects about, for instance, contemporary Swedish feminist comics, right? And feminist comic art. And yeah, so without further ado, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. So really, I'd like to start actually by thanking Labex EFL for arranging the seminar series, Jonathan Ginsberg for hosting me, and also the Birgit and Gerd Rausing Foundation for supporting my application. So for this first seminar, I'd also like to set the scene by presenting an abridged version of the abstract for the seminar series. Basically, swearing is a type of language that allows us to convey negative feelings and sensations, which is essential for self-expression, self-preservation, and interpersonal communication. The utility of swear words is particularly evident in an increasingly polarized society. Swearing is a form of linguistic expression which involves invoking taboos that are culturally and socially recognized as likely to cause offense. But swearing is also characteristic of informal social interaction among friends and intimates, symbolizing solidarity and minimizing social distance. Swearing has even been acclaimed as a marker of intelligence, honesty, integrity, and high social status. The use of swear words thus has positive as well as negative connotations and functions, such that the benefits of swearing now rival its stigma as bad behavior. Consequently, swearers are just as likely to be cheered as they are chastised. Essential to swearing as a complex social phenomenon is its inherent power, widely recognized, if not always equally experienced. Indeed, the power of swearing as offensive language is not absolute. It's simply the tension resulting from the potential to offend, which is in turn maintained by both intrapersonal and interpersonal variability that allows swear words to retain their inherent force. The power of swearing is thus sustained by, but also vulnerable to, variation in individual relationships to swear word usage. This seminar series thusly proposes an ecosystem of swearing to be explored via various themes, and today we're focusing on the swearing paradox. So in this seminar, my aim is to introduce swearing research in the field of sociolinguistics, presenting common methodologies, findings, and especially challenges, including defining swearing, avoiding researcher bias, and advocating for swearing as a focus of interdisciplinary scientific research. The seminar features some interactive elements in the form of sample data collection and offensiveness ratings, so as to illustrate a problem that has plagued swearing research as informed by studies of frequency and offensiveness, namely the swearing paradox, or the status of swearing as both highly frequent and highly offensive. In this seminar, I'll also address these questions. So what is swearing exactly? As a researcher of swearing, I have noticed that this topic, maybe in contrast to some other topics in linguistics, is easy to talk about with the general public because everybody seems to know what swearing is. No one has ever knitted their brow and asked me to explain it. On the contrary, nearly everyone I encounter has a story, anecdote, or example to share with me that serves to explain to me how each person understands what swearing is. Most people's first associations with and examples of swearing are very similar, which is perhaps not surprising at first blush, but actually is very interesting. So this is where I'd like to get a little bit interactive with you, and I'd ask that all of you just think about what swearing is to you. Like, how would you define it if you had to? Just think about that first, and what kind of maybe prototypical examples of swearing pop into your head. You don't have to share it just yet, but I'd like everyone to kind of have a picture.
I'm gonna yell it, but.
Yeah, well, actually, you're welcome to do that. So what kind of like pops into your head when you think of swearing?
Motherfucker.
Yeah, okay. And what kind of situation?
Well, you know, the interesting thing about swearing for me is that, you know, I don't know if, yeah, I don't know yet what the swearing paradox is, so I'm excited
Yeah.
to find out about
Yeah.
it. But the interesting thing for me is it's at the same time, you know, you can use this particular set of linguistic expressions in a way when you're, you know, very serious and after very thought out and really want to describe someone as, and, you know, they have a horrible character or something and to like an insult or something. And at the same time, you can, you know, so it's like they have a certain amount of weight to them, like they have, on the one hand, this like enormous amount of weight to them that can be very insulting, you know, and so you could really, so you need to measure your words and so on. On the other hand, they're the most automatic thing that like you trip and fall and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
or whatever. So they are at the same time, you know, something that you have to pay really attention to and that, you know, that you have to, or that you do. And on the other hand, they come up like.
They come automatically, exactly, yeah. All right, so keep maybe your examples in your head, and then I would just kind of show you this example. Every once in a while, I train myself to do this. I Google, you know, what swearing is, and I look at images, and just to see, you know, what is it changing at all? But the result is consistently like pictures like this. Where swearing is censored mostly by what is known as grolics. Grolics are these combinations of symbols that represent swearing. The swearing is almost in the form of angrily exclaimed expletives, indicated by speech balloons with these jagged edges, snarls, furrowed brows, puffs of smoke, shaken fists, or yelling mouths. So this has long been the conventional way to represent swearing, and it feeds into our stereotypes of what swearing is. And really, it's rightly so, because at its core, swearing is an expression of strong or strongly negative feelings. But swearing is actually much more than this, as we will see, and which you were on your way to getting into, Heather. So we really want to think about what is swearing? How can we define it? In attempting to isolate swearing conceptually from other forms of taboo language, Jim O'Driscoll in 2020 highlighted one core defining feature. That is, the potential for such words, through their very utterance, to be offensive and to arouse negative reactions from others. So at least we here all agree that swearing is the use of taboo words, phrases, or language, which in turn can be referred to collectively in a variety of ways, such as these words here. Most of these terms are used interchangeably, but Timothy Jay, in his book from 1999, Cursing in America, does devote a chapter to distinguishing between several of these monikers. I always use the terms swear words and swearing. As I've mentioned, most people have a general working idea of what is meant by swearing, even if they may refer to and will be able to identify prototypical swear words in their own language, regardless of whether they routinely swear themselves. Coming up with swear words is initially quite easy, but knowing when to stop may be a bit more difficult, since lots of words may be considered swear words, or at least vulgar or obscene. We think we know what swearing is, but actually defining it definitively is quite difficult. So I would just point out this repeated hedging in these definitions that you can see in such words as potential, might, likely, or practically. In particular, take note of the last quote, which really muddies the waters. Swearing seems to be an example of something that's difficult to define, but you know it when you see it.
I was gonna say,
Yeah,
just like.
I'm glad you did.
I once made that joke in front of a class where all of my students were French, and they were just like, you know, like the judge in the US, I was like, no, there you go. Now I'm talking about pornography to a mathematical linguistics French class.
Well, I'm glad that you noticed that. Additional attempts to define swearing have invoked criteria, with several researchers agreeing on some core components. At least one of these criteria, however, is hotly contested, namely the non-literal usage. I personally don't agree with this criteria, and I believe it's losing favor anyway. But we'll see. Oh, I'm sorry, literal usage, not the non-literal, but the literal usage. We will see examples of literal usages, so we can revisit and discuss this criterion. But again, these criteria confirm that swearing is, by its very nature, a taboo activity. As such, it's often socially sanctioned or punished through a variety of informal and formal mechanisms, for example, fines, social disapproval, censorship, or omission or removal. However, while this consequence of swearing helps to maintain its taboo, it does not in any way diminish the frequency or spread of its use. With that said, we're inching our way closer to the swearing paradox, which asks how it can be that something so taboo as swearing can also be so frequent. So before continuing and looking at examples of swear words, need to make clear that this topic of offensive language means that swear words will appear in uncensored form. I will be saying them out loud. I will ask you to think about swear words, and if you're willing, even to write some down. It's a common practice among those of us who conduct research on swearing to include these kinds of warnings and provide our audiences with exit plans. I'm assuming that you all knew what you signed up for in attending, but I will nevertheless say that now is your chance for a sortie if you're in any way uncomfortable. Okay. Well, thank you for staying. So before moving on, I'd ask that you, I don't know if you have paper, maybe you can do this in your head, but just for a few seconds, can you come up with some swear words, ideally in English? We've heard one example already. Come up with some swear words just for a few seconds, see if you can keep a running list. Give you maybe 10 seconds.
Well, there's the George Carlin list.
Yeah, if you know that one, sure. That's kind of easy to maybe rely on.
Words that we use, or words that
Any that you can think of, any that you know, not that you necessarily use, but just any that you know. If I stop you now, how many have you thought of so far? 3, 5,
6, yes.
Well, I have,
I censored myself.
Yeah, okay, interesting,
I
yeah.
have 3 ones where I'm like, definitely, and then 2 where I'm like, oh, I don't know, maybe, are they,
Yeah,
they're not
okay.
like something
So
I would
maybe-
necessarily yell out, but it's like, are they the same as the other 3 here?
Yeah, right, so maybe around 5 or so,
Yeah.
yeah, and how many?
I'm a bit better than that because I'm not very proficient in swearing.
In English, yeah, okay, all right.
I can recognize a swear word, but I can't produce it.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting. I hope you attend the 4th seminar, because that will be interesting to you, I believe. So with these words, there are only a handful here, but if I asked you to think about the offensiveness of the words that you came up with, and I gave you a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not offensive at all, 10 being the most offensive, can you kind of just assign some numbers to those words?
Five and 11.
And 11 even, you went off the
Yeah.
scale. That's nice to hear. Okay, then let's continue.
So we're supposed to tell you? or-
Nope, it just, you can tell me later, I'll give you a chance to tell me later on. But just to kind of go through the exercise. So in modern times, most recognizable swear words fall into one of 3 core categories: religion, sex and sexual body parts or functions, and words related to bodily excretions or functions. With reference to these categories, Jeffrey Hughes noted that swearing shows a curious convergence of the high and the low.
This is
Sacred-
English, this is for English.
Yes,
There's also a question of native language, no? I mean, because like, I know that when French people use or hear English curse words, I think for them it's they'll put on their t-shirts.
yes, yeah,
Whereas
Mm.
Americans might not.
no. Yeah, so, well, the categories tend to be, at least in kind of Western cultures, they tend to be stable. But these are examples, of course, of English swear words.
Right, no, so
Yeah.
I meant the categories, because
Yeah.
I think, yeah, there's kind of, as I understand, there's a variation, so even within Europe, there's this kind of like the Dutch have lots of the scatological stuff.
Yes, and they might also, I know that Denmark has a category for disease. They have swear
Yeah.
words for diseases. There's a lot of swearing by mother or other kinship terms. So these are very kind of general, basic core categories of swearing. But of course, even within these categories, there's some conflation, for example, between the sexual and excretory functions and body parts. There's also variation in the offensiveness of some of these core words or categories over time. Thus, the religious category, while still containing recognizable swear words, is likely to be less offensive to many people in contemporary society than it might have been in the past, or to constitute today what might be milder forms of swearing than many of the words in the sexual or excretory categories. And by contrast, the lower physical faculties of copulation, defecation, and urination have become much more prominent as swear word reference. So now I'd like to know, did any of the words that you came up with fall into these categories?
Yeah.
For example, this one.
Well, I had contradict.
Yeah, there you go. All right.
Yeah, I but so then I had asshole, which was my borderline one.
Okay,
Because I didn't know if it was too much, and then, Jesus and asshole are like the.
Yeah.
And
right.
I mean, I also had fucker, wanker, and bust.
Okay.
What's
There's
that?
some I didn't put down because I didn't consider them.
Yeah, I don't consider the ones at the
Like,
top.
oh my God.
They don't.
Yeah.
they
I
don't-
say Jesus all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I also swear all the time, maybe you swear all the time.
Does that count? Yeah, I guess so.
No, but the bastard.
Sure, yeah, exactly, those are the cases where I was like, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And then more so I think about it, I was thinking how my wife's Italian and I hang out with Italians, and I would adopt a lot of it, but I don't even know what they mean.
Well, yeah,
They don't even fit into, I mean, I know there's some reflection that their body parts usually,
Mm.
but they just use them all the time.
But there also tend to be these kind of expressions, so these sort of formulaic expressions of swearing that people use a lot. And maybe like there are lots of ways to curse somebody out, but we're trying to boil this down to actual swear words. And then maybe these swear words will fall into these categories.
So interestingly enough, you don't have slur and slur.
well,
right?
so my
No,
11,
getting to that, yeah.
so
Mm.
I put the N word as my like
Mm,
11, but
yeah.
then the more I thought about it, I was like, oh, that's more of a slur.
Yeah,
It was the kind of taboo aspect and the insulting aspect that I was thinking of. But then it's true that it's not from the same, it doesn't have the same like, distribution linguistically
yeah,
as,
But you could imagine it happening and being used in, if you're like in a situation, aggressive situation,
Yeah.
but you could imagine it being used.
Absolutely.
Right, so-
yeah.
So in
yeah.
that sense, the slow words do have similar.
Mm.
Should.
but you're not gonna stub your toe.
And say, right. So that actually provides a nice segue to the next one. So I mentioned earlier that it's easy to start listing swear words, but it may be difficult to stop. If you give people ample time to list swear words or examples of taboo language, you will get a lot of variety, but it also becomes clear that there is a core set of words. When I embarked on swearing research, there weren't that many studies available to consult, but enough to establish that there was a set of swear words that were common to all of them. So instead of using a definition that required interpretation of practically all words, my point of departure has always been the words themselves, focusing on those that have consistently been identified as swear words by other researchers. This is a practice that Robbie Love has also adopted, but coming up with a slightly different list for British English on his part. And in this list, you may notice words like piss, gay, Jesus Christ, oh my God, are not included. I don't deny the status of these words or similar as potentially offensive, but they're not reliably identified as swear words in the research. And so I don't include them in my own studies. And now I just want to say that working with swear words tends to desensitize you as a researcher, and poring over these words and moving them from one list to another and taking note of compounds and novel forms and all the work that you do with it you can kind of forget that they can be offensive. So I'd like to pay a little bit of attention now to the offensiveness of swearing. To a certain extent, offensiveness is learned and both socially and culturally transmitted. There's nothing inherently offensive about a word in its orthographic or phonetic form. But of course, we use language to process the world we live in, and we need words to help us talk about such things that scare us, afflict us, or arouse us. If we consider the expression speak of the devil, or references to God as G-D, to sex as SEX, or to cancer as the C word, we can understand the belief that language can invoke reality. If we think of the devil or hell and they scare us, that feeling will become associated with the words, and the words will become associated with the feeling. If we're disgusted by bodily fluids or aroused by sexuality, then the same process of linking words with emotion will occur when we speak of these. In this way, the taboo of particular topics is transferred to the words denoting these topics, such that the words are just as offensive or gross or impolite as the behaviors. Now, what we consider offensive, gross, or impolite, or otherwise view negatively may change over time, and we may also become more or less sensitive. But with regard to swearing, the main categories of religion, sex, and body tend to maintain their taboo status. Insults, slurs, and derogatory terms are much more dynamic and shifting and arguably more offensive than many swear words. But again, it's important to distinguish between the two. So earlier, when you jotted down some swear words, I asked you to rate them on a scale of like 1 to 10 for offensiveness. And in so doing, I subjected you to some conventional methodology and swear word research. First, researchers often ask people to list as many swear words as they can within a limited amount of time to find out what kinds of words people will include in the category, and also to see which words get noted first. Then it's common in swearing research to ask people to rate swear words on a scale of offensiveness or something similar to offensiveness. So this is what it can look like. And in fact, I used this exact method in one of my own studies. It's always interesting to see results of such ratings because they tend to confirm both interpersonal and intrapersonal variation. When we compare people, not everyone rates swear words the same, and looking at only one person, not all swear words get rated the same, or at least it's rare. There is at least one glaring problem with this methodology. But before I get into that, let's see how this variation can look. So the results we see here were based on a survey completed by 60 students at an American university, corresponding to about 55% men, 45% women. Each of the respondents completed the ratings test that we saw in the previous slide. So the results confirm a variation in perceived offensiveness between swear words and between people. For example, damn and hell are the least offensive. Cunt, fuck, and motherfucker are the most offensive. It's interesting to note, however, that for many of the words, the most frequent rating provided was a 1, suggesting a good deal of agreement among respondents in terms of overall perception of swearing. But considering the higher averages and the ranges of the standard deviations, there's also a very great range of perceptions as well. Now it gets a little more interesting when we take a look at the offensiveness rating sorted now by gender, where women consistently rate all of the swear words as more offensive than the men do. Sorting by gender also highlights the fact that women are in greater agreement about cunt being highly offensive, while men agree most on damn being the least offensive. Here, I would also point out that traditionally, swearing research has focused on and even sensationalized the differences between the genders when it comes to swearing, when in reality, there are many more similarities. And here I'd like to explain that the previous slides with ratings and results, and the very next slides that present findings from my research published in 2012, much of which was based on my dissertation. And for that study, I conducted my own observations of spontaneous speech. I outsourced additional observations, and then I recruited participants for a written survey and an interview. So this was a university student population, which was and remains even today, predominantly white and middle class. But my data did also represent people of color. So I have some interesting observations with data with regard to race, but the representation of non-white races was too little to draw any reliable conclusions. And I would also add that the lack of non-white and non-middle class representation continues to plague swearing research. So before moving on, I'd like to return to the problem I hinted at earlier with offensiveness ratings as a methodology. So for those of you who tried to rate some of your swear words with regards to offensiveness, I'm wondering what you were thinking. Did you just know like 2, 4, 1? Or did you have to think, okay, how might this be used? Can anyone share? Like what did you do before you put a number next to a word?
I didn't think about it too much, but I did compare them to each other, saying this is relatively worse. And
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so some swear words, we kind of have a hierarchy
Yes.
of swear words. Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, I thought, well, like content find even difficult to say almost.
Yeah.
Where it's like the other, like asshole, like whatever, like,
Yeah.
you know, I talk or something is very easy for me to say even in like a talk. Whereas content's still like, "Ew."
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
it's like there's a certain, you know, almost physical, some of them give you almost physical reactions and then others it's like any other word.
Nice. Anything to add there? Similar? Yeah. When I conducted interviews, so I recruited for interviews from among the people who took the survey. And it was really important for me to find out, how did they do it? How did they actually do this offensiveness ratings task? So the interview data revealed that people orient, first of all, to the evaluative adjective that they're given, such as offensive. How offensive is this word? But there's no further control over this process, such that the researcher can't really know how the respondents are thinking and just what exactly they're imagining when performing the ratings task. We noticed on the previous slides that many people rated certain swear words as ones, so not offensive, and yet the averages and standard deviations show many other people have much higher ratings. So are these people imagining the same kinds of usages, but experiencing them as different degrees of offensiveness? Or do the different ratings correspond to different imagined usages? Without questioning each respondent, we don't know the answers. So for this reason, I find this practice of listing swear words in isolation and imposing an evaluative adjective rather problematic. I included it in my own study merely to illustrate this weakness, which is made even more obvious by juxtaposing the task of single word rating with words in context. So here are some examples of extracts of actual conversations heard during the observation of spontaneous speech. So these were all collected during like the field note phase of the study. These examples illustrate ways of using swear words that may not come to mind when someone is asked to rate a single swear word in terms of its offensiveness. Recall that the 2 respondents in the previous slide mentioned imagining swear words used in an aggressive way or to call someone a name. Neither situation is represented here. And these are 2 of a series of examples that survey respondents were asked to rate after rating the words in a list. The ratings task was otherwise unchanged in that words were marked in bold and respondents were asked to rate them for offensiveness on a scale of 1 to 10. So here are 2 more examples also collected during the observation phase, so observing spontaneous speech. So these are actual examples. And in each example, I would ask that you notice the repeated use of swear words within the same term. So this is actually a really frequent phenomenon and something that I call self-echoic behavior. And then 2 final examples. Before we see the results, let's consider how these swear words in bold are used. So recall that one of the criteria for swear words was that they would not be used in a literal sense. So these two examples include shit, used literally to mean excrement, and fucking, used literally to mean sexual intercourse. I'd be interested to hear your opinion, but this to me is actually swearing. Now, to be sure, it's very different from the shit we saw earlier in, if you're gonna get the shit, get the shit. And it's very different from the fucking used in, he's just fucking around. But I can't really accept that this is not swearing. And again, I think overall, I think researchers are abandoning that one criterion, but it still strikes me as odd that such examples would maybe be omitted from data. At any rate, this series of 6 examples of swear words used in context were rated according to the same scale. So let's see the results and compare a little bit.
Can I just?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to go back?
Yeah,
Mm.
to me, it's not like shit is not,
Oh, you don't think
I
it's,
don't view that as swearing, no, I mean, so I think it's ambiguous.
I wouldn't say it in front of my grandma's dead, but I wouldn't say it, when she was alive, I wouldn't say it, I wouldn't be like, oh, it smells like poo in front of my grandma.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah,
And then number 6, I would say, it's still offensive that he's talking about, having sex with his girlfriend with that language.
Yeah.
It's still,
I mean, to me, that it actually reminds me a little bit more of like the issues, the offensiveness, maybe even of slurs or something, like some aspect of, like, it's less of, yeah, it's like not the same uses, but it's like, nevertheless, it's like, you're saying something that's like really inappropriate, it's like, not a nice thing, it's something you don't say that in like nice company or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah, but if you change
Yeah.
the fucking to making love, I don't know if that's, does it,
yeah.
So,
it changes a little bit,
It's-
right?
yeah,
It's
it
a
makes
bit
it a
less
bit-
sexist somehow, but it's, it's still,
No,
you know.
but it's, for me, it's much less offensive. You say making love.
he's currently making love to his.
No, it's still awkward.
yes,
It's still something you would.
I think it would be viewed as kind of weird, right, to say.
well, it's
yeah.
weird, even just having this conversation is a very like kind of sexisty thing to, you like just, if I'd be like, you've seen Josh around, he's like, probably, I'd be like, yeah, he's probably like, out, with his girlfriend or
Yeah.
something.
Mhm. Well, okay, that's interesting.
No, that thing
Yeah.
has an effect.
Okay,
Well, it just seems, actually, my question is, beyond the kind of, I don't know, we'd say like, put their thumb in French, like, we have, why is it important to decide whether this is swearing or not, right? Like presumably, I mean, we have all of these different words, they all have different histories, they all, things are very, some of them make me, tense up a bit when I say them, some of them do, I mean, they're clearly very diverse anyways. And I understand that like in normal language, we have this idea about swearing, don't swear, etc. But from a linguistic or scientific point of view, to what extent is this actually something that's important to decide whether these are swear words or whether this is an instance of swearing?
so that we can have an idea of what swear words are, because they are, which I'll talk about in 2 weeks, they are kind of a unique subset of the lexicon that have these properties that no other words have. Even when you said, like, you can have a physical reaction if you try to say the word cunt.
Sure, but that's a property of,
Yeah.
well, maybe I'll just listen to your talk some more, and then you'll tell me what these properties are, because that's a property of cunt, but it's not a property of Jesus, for example.
Right,
So then,
but only
why are
for
we
you.
grouping, so I see, so the idea is that someone else so there's a set of expressions. The way you identify swear words would be, it's suppose you have this, physical criteria, and the way you identify swear words, you're like, does someone somewhere, tense up when they
Yeah.
try to say Jesus or ass or something like
Yeah.
that?
Exactly. So it's important to find out, I think it's important to find out, what is this group of words? And maybe the borders, are not, they're a little bit with dotted lines.
Mhm.
But what is this group of words that can cause offense and that maybe we need to identify as swearing? So if you talk to someone and you have a conversation, you walk away with that conversation, I ask you, did that person swear? most people will remember, yeah, actually, like the words, they're noted, they're marked. Maybe some people don't react, physically, but we tend to notice them. They tend to have these effects or trigger reactions that no other words do. And even if it doesn't trigger a reaction in you, it might in other people. So we need to have an awareness that there is this kind of variability, and that will affect how we form relationships and whether we, get upset or get happy, and feel closer to a person or further away, if we're insulted, or if, a range of all things.
Yeah, so that, but in that case, right, so if the question is it imaginable that someone hearing dialogues 5 or 6 would have this kind of physical reaction? And I think the answer is clearly yes, right? So in that case, they are swear words. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, but maybe you're starting to see, like, it can be very difficult to figure out what exactly is a swear word.
Well, that's why
yeah.
that's the reason, because it seems to me, not having studied this at all, it seems to be extremely difficult to define what is a swear word. So I was just wondering why exactly we would like to, this is an intellectual project we really want to be engaged in.
Yeah. In fact, I think that's a great question, because I don't know if I would argue that it is super important to be able to define swearing. If one person thinks that something is swearing, that's meaningful to me. But also, what I tend to focus on is not trying to decide, what's going into that category, but rather, where are we in the greatest agreement upon what's swearing, and why does everyone agree these words are swearing, and then kind of go from there back out. Yeah, but there were some other hands up.
Yeah, just go.
And you go first.
I'm just wondering to what extent, though, this is sort of an instance of somehow politeness, or in the sense that, there are also constructions, just, even in for instance, electrical constructions, which you're not supposed to use if you're gonna be polite, right? For instance, like a question, a sort of very brief question that you say something with why. So that's kind of like, it's kind of a rather brutal question. And, or for instance, difference between, in French, being saying, comment and quoi, right? So if I say quoi, that's a bit, just like that, it's not very polite, right? So if somebody heard me saying quoi to they're visiting, to you, let's say, or to visiting, a big interest, what, that would be considered to be impolite, right? And it would be probably remembered as being something that is kind of, out of the ordinary. So in that sense, I wondered to what extent swearing is just an instance of kind of slightly deviant behavior in some sense, but it's but there's a whole bunch of other kind of deviance from the kind of the pleasant, sort of the equilibrium kind of interaction.
Sure, but there's also the possibility that, because I've looked at swearing as examples of making pragmatic moves. So, you can use swearing to make a move towards someone. So saying quoi could be an indication that I feel kind of comfortable enough with you to just say quoi. And also I feel comfortable enough with you to start swearing a little bit. So the fact that it can be impolite is really crucial to it being available to us for closing social distance.
Along the same lines, I was thinking that what makes them a class is something along the lines of like being, making one's attitude available, so like whether it's for, finding closer proximity or less, you're letting your interlocutor know that, what your attitude is towards something.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. And how you're reading the situation. And it might be automatic. It might be something you can't control. And then you tend to hear people talking about, they slipped or they made a mistake, or it's just reading the room and feeling, okay, this is good. And we do this without really even thinking about it.
Or here, because we have permission to do it.
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the, just a comparison of some of these results. So the table at the top is just a reminder of the ratings of the single swear words. And that these words were also kind of copied similarly in the contextualized ratings task. So for example, where ass as a single word without any context was on average rated as a 3.2 on the scale, in context, it was rated 2.4. And I acknowledge that we can't exactly do these one-to-one comparisons of like motherfucker and motherfucking or fuck and fucking, but this comparison does give us some indication of how context influences the experience of offensiveness. And looking through the rest of the words, we can see that they're all less than or equal to the single word scores. And the two words that are rated as high as the single words are shit from extract 5 and fucking from extract 6. So these are the two examples that we were talking about. The one was, it smelled like shit about a dirty towel, and he's probably out fucking his girlfriend. So that's to say that these two examples of using swear words were what I would argue are literal, but that's also, the respondents kind of talking about that. And these are the ones that get rated as most offensive. And the ones that come closest to the high ratings of the single swear words. So let's just see what some participants thought of those examples. So these explanations suggest that people do experience these quasi-literal usages of swear words as different from other usages. And in this respect, we can maybe understand why some researchers would want to maybe disqualify them as swear words. But I should also point out that these examples represent actually the rarest kind of swearing, at least in my observations and in this data set, as do the kinds of swearing that were imagined by the two interview participants featured in a previous slide for the single word ratings. So they were the ones who thought about aggressiveness and name call. Yeah.
So did you ever have a follow-up or something when you asked people to rate those, not those, but the relevant dialogues with who and, not making love is weird, but out,
Yeah.
but out with his girlfriend, because in both of those cases, it's not just, if I say, oh, I'm fucking late for class, like fuck, I'm late for class or something, like what I'm describing is not particularly distasteful. Whereas, in the case with the two guys talking, there's clearly this like sexism that you're getting from the discourse. And then, the woman is describing a legitimately like gross situation.
Yeah.
So how much, in that, it would be nice
Right,
to know
yeah,
how much
right.
is coming from the particular swear word and how much of the offense is coming because the person's actually like describing unpleasant things.
No, I did not do a follow-up, but that's a really good question. But so.
Or did you have other, I don't know, gross things with, you'd be like, oh, it smelled like ass.
No, no, I didn't make up anything.
Sure.
Yeah, so I just, had to kind of use whatever examples were available to me, but that's, so just out of curiosity, like, would you think that providing another example, like this towel smelled like poop, that should,
like pee or something.
Yeah.
Poop, yeah. This towel smelled like poop.
Okay, so it wouldn't be figurative. I would take you.
No, but I think that's what you're saying is that those are the non-figurative.
yeah, right.
I just think it's like hard to, it's like not surprising to me at all that those were the ones that people found the most offensive, because they both have the offensive language,
Yeah.
whatever that is. And they also have like people behaving, in a way that offends me as a feminist, and people, talking about something that would offend my nostrils if I was there. So
it's hard to tease out the
Yeah.
offensiveness to just like be a function of the swear word. Yeah, I get it. No, we gotta consider that. Absolutely, that it might be contributing for sure. Okay, so the series of slides so far, I hope, has established that swear words are associated with several different categories of taboo, and as such are offensive insofar as their associated taboos are offensive. And we've so far also learned that offensiveness ratings tasks are a common methodology in swearing research, showing interpersonal and interpersonal variation, and even variation between swear words, depending on how they're used or how they're imagined to be used. And finally, we've learned that the type of swearing that's rated as most offensive is not actually a type of swearing that occurs most frequently, or didn't in this data set. So as a researcher, I tend to adopt the kind of Western Anglophone perspective, and drawing in particular on my American background, where swearing is certainly prevalent, but where frequency is not in parity with acceptance. There's very little evidence of nuanced understandings of swearing in public policy, which rather reflects categorical opposition to swearing. We may roll our eyes at the hypocrisy of a population numb to the proverbial sticks and stones, but overly sensitive to words. But I would argue that actions to preserve the offensiveness of swearing ultimately serve the greater good. Without offense, there is no swearing. So let's turn to another common methodology in swearing research. People really love to talk about swearing, and whenever swearing makes the news, journalists like to talk to researchers. For this reason, I've participated in a lot of like newspaper, radio, podcast, and television interviews. And what do people always want to know? Well, they want to know how offensive is swearing. That's one. And they want to know how frequent it is. How much do we swear? Could you even answer that if I asked you, how much do you swear? Could you even answer that question? And how would you even attempt to answer it? How much do you swear? What would you even say? Also really common. People love to like use swearing to talk about swearing too. It's not easy. You could maybe say, you know, these multiple choice answers, often, sometimes, rarely, never. You could maybe say number of times per day or per week. But we just don't know, you know, what are the parameters for calculating frequency? So I can tell you, when I conducted observations of spontaneous speech, my team and we collected 500 examples in 1 week. Does that mean anything? I mean, I don't even know if that has any meaning.
One could, for instance, like we do in laughter, quantify
Yeah.
things with the amount per term.
Yeah.
To utterance, right? And then you could, then I imagine you would see significant variation across different situations.
Yeah.
Different corporate, yeah.
Oh, sure.
Quite
Yeah, and I'll look
massive
at
variations.
some corporate too. Yeah. Yeah. So counting just has its own challenges, but translating like counts into some kind of frequency that you can answer a question like, oh, how much do we swear? That's really difficult. So I've shared with you the kinds of words that I would count, but other researchers may include more or even fewer words. And just like I asked if you can answer, you know, how much do you swear? Researchers try to determine frequency. For example, one way based on self-report data. And I don't know if anyone's used self-report data, but it can be, you know, a little bit unreliable. And I've actually experienced, like I've gone out and I've tried to do like observations of spontaneous speech, and I've done things to make me as much of a fly on the wall as possible. But I think we're all familiar with the observer's paradox, and whether, you know, having someone around you inhibits your behavior is an unknown. And I also wonder, you know, how much do we swear when we're alone? And if there's no one around to hear us swear, does that still count? So let's look at these challenges a little bit more closely. Okay, so here are some examples of words that have been included in frequency counts. So when people are trying to figure out, you know, how much do we swear? These are the words that they're looking at. Many of my colleagues and myself, we find ourselves debating even acronyms like WTF or FFS, you know, MILF, LMFAO. Is that swearing? Or is it actually not swearing because it's an abbreviation? Do we see, like when you see those, do you read them as swearing or do you just see the letters? If some of us do see it, read it, kind of hear it in our minds as swearing, but others don't, then is it swearing? So, you know, counting can be actually really difficult.
Quite by queer, then they mean that.
Well, that's some of these like, so queer, the MILF that you said really like lean into the slur. maybe Judy also.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, I find this problematic because if you think back to that quote, like practically any word can be a swear word. We can just, we're swearing all the time if we expand this list so much more.
I have to go.
Thank you, but thank you for being here.
I can stay for another 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so since we're here, what is MILF and what's FFF? You want MILF it?
Oh.
You're a MILF. So it's an acronym for Mom, I'd like to fuck. Really? People, I've never.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the American Pie movies? No. Oh, okay.
Hmm.
That's the origin?
That's for fuck's sake.
Oh,
Yeah. Mm, yeah.
okay, thank you.
Mm.
I don't know if that's the origin, but I think at least in our cult, like, in terms of depiction, so Stifler's mom is like the. That's how I learned what this term meant and what it could,
Mm.
in our imaginary it would be.
Yeah. I don't know if they used it. I didn't see it, but I
What
don't
is
know if
it,
they used it,
Jennifer Coolidge,
Yeah.
her character in American Pie. I'm so
Yeah.
glad this is being recorded.
Um,
Especially the part I called me. Yeah, thanks, Heather. I was thinking, I was like, for some people, it's like a compliment.
All right, the multiple choice answers of often, sometimes, rarely, never have become even somewhat of a meme, which tells us if we hadn't suspected already that these answers are very difficult to interpret. Of course, it's meaningful if someone reports that they never swear. But how do we even understand often or sometimes? How do we know that we are aligned in our understanding of these terms? Nevertheless, it's useful to gather some data that can be followed up on in subsequent interviews. For example, what would be an occasion when someone may try to avoid swearing, when someone may swear more or less frequently, or when someone may have slipped, so used a swear word by accident. And if people have answers to such questions, then they may also have some personal rules for swearing. And this is what I'm going to look at during the next seminar. So according to these tables, nearly all of the white and African-American male respondents reported swearing sometimes or often. And all of the white male respondents reported that there were situations in which they tried to swear less frequently, compared to just over half of the African-American male respondents. And following up on this in the interviews, it seems that white males swear as a default behavior, such that swearing is almost a privilege of their majority status. African-American males, on the other hand, reported monitoring their swearing to a much greater extent, swearing frequently in particular contexts only. They did not report slipping or trying to swear less frequently, as their swearing is already rule governed. Looking at the white and African-American female respondents, we see indications that the former respondents are more rule governed than the latter and more likely to monitor and suppress swearing behavior. Like their male counterparts, the African-American female students are more likely to limit not only their swearing, but interactions in general to particular contexts where very few adjustments need to be made. In the white majority of this student population, the data from the white female respondents indicate that their swearing behavior shows a deference to their male counterparts. And that is, gender is a meaningful variable, whereas the data for the African-American respondents indicated that race was more meaningful than gender. And in fact, it was an interesting finding in general about this study population that swearing behavior tended to be racially bound, such that swearing was generally atypical of interracial interaction. So this is just one variable of a communicative situation that may prompt a respondent to report swearing more or less frequently, or practicing avoidance, which raises the question, what exactly do we want to know when we ask about frequency? I mentioned the observer's paradox earlier, referring to William Naboth's famous argument that the simple presence of the researcher is likely to influence the very people she's trying to observe, such that natural behavior may be inhibited. So swearing is very much an in-group behavior, so it may be particularly vulnerable to inhibitive effects of out-group members. Maybe one way to collect spontaneous speech is by recording, as was done for the spoken parts of the British national corpus. So the question is whether the observer's paradox even applies to these audio recordings that were used. And a few researchers have addressed this question in the context of the spoken parts of the corpora, agreeing that the answer is no. However, the possibility that swearers are inhibited when they know they're being recorded or somehow perform for the sake of the recording can never be entirely ruled out, undermining the accuracy of frequency measurements. As noted in a recent study by Tony McHenry and colleagues, a documented reprimand to stop swearing may reflect a natural reaction, but it could also be due to an awareness of being recorded. In a recent experiment, Richard Stevens and his team, including myself, have collected data based on the method of autobiographical memory prompting. Autobiographical memory prompts provide an opportunity to access occurrences of swearing that would otherwise be impervious to observation or recording methodologies. In this experiment, participants were asked for a series of 6 swear words to provide a memory for each and include contextual information. The resulting data were coded for the mentions of presence of others, such that the swearing recollection was socially contextualized. Among the total of 1,560 swearing memories, only 36% indicated that swearing occurred in the presence of others. Thus, 64% of the entire data set of memories focused on private swearing events with no overt indication of any other interlocutor being present. This predominance of private swearing memories suggests that swearing may be far more frequent than so far calculated. The participant-wide tendency to focus on one's own private swearing suggests that, at least in the experiment condition, social swearing or interpersonal swearing is not immediately accessible as memorable or noteworthy, despite it being the most common type of swearing represented in empirical research. So we return to the question from earlier. No one is around to hear us swear. Should it still be included in frequency counts? And also, are we any closer to answering, how frequent is swearing? Here are just some calculations that represent averages according to corpus studies and self-report data. But while some people may, for example, swear, 80 times a day, every day, some people don't swear every day. And some people don't swear at all. I haven't actually personally understood the obsession with frequency. And I feel like there's always an agenda, to show that swearing is really frequent. And yes, absolutely, sometimes it is, but also sometimes swearing is completely absent. And I think that's really meaningful.
Sorry, just the first line, is that for an individual?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the other 2 are not, right?
No, those are exactly. This one's individual. This was from the MySpace. So if you looked at users, so this was the single users total word counts. Mm-hmm. So variation is the most important aspect of swearing, but having established that swearing is indeed frequent sometimes and in some places, and that swearing is indeed offensive sometimes and in some places, we can take a look at the swearing paradox. So when I first started researching swearing, the field really was in its infancy, and it was dominated by 2 main methodological targets: offensiveness ratings and frequency counts. So according to the first target, study participants were consistently asked to rate the offensiveness of either single swear words, whereby offensive or some other negative evaluative adjective was imposed, or they rated examples of hypothetical contexts of swearing in response to pain, frustration, or anger. And together, these studies established swearing as highly offensive. And according to the second target, swearing episodes were either counted or self-reported, but the definitions of swearing showed no stringency, such that anything from cow to idiot to oh my God was counted. And together, these studies established swearing as highly frequent. The swearing paradox therefore notes the problematic conclusion that swearing is both highly frequent and highly offensive. So why does the swearing paradox even matter? I like to think of it like this. If swearing were truly offensive, surely it wouldn't be so frequent. And if swearing were truly frequent, surely the offensiveness would abate. So the resolution to the swearing paradox is the acknowledgement that the kind of swearing that is frequent isn't actually the most offensive. And the kind of swearing that people find the most offensive isn't actually the kind that's most frequent. So the paradox highlights methodological problems that have plagued the field and contributed to a misunderstanding of swearing. Meaningful research and an informed understanding of swearing depends on methodological clarity, transparency, and validity. So the inherent complexity of swearing, combined with its social meaningfulness, require research integrity to combat the titillation and obfuscation. The swearing paradox reminds us that variation is the key to the power of swearing. Swear words differ, ways of using swear words differ, frequencies, functions, and perceptions differ. If we all use the same swear words in equal measure with the same emotional perception and in predictable contexts, swear words as we know them would cease to be. I see swearing as 100% social and an interpersonal phenomenon. So this argument really centers on interpersonal and intrapersonal variation and variability as the absolute keys to swearing. When I first started the research, I was really surprised by first of all, the lack of research that was available and the tendency to ignore or even avoid the topic of swearing, and also this kind of one-dimensional view on swearing. So the more I discovered the nuanced social and pragmatic functions of swearing, the more frustrated I found myself getting with these persistent stereotypes of swearing. But later, I realized actually that these stereotypes are like critical for the survival of swear words. And I hope that sounds as dramatic as I want it to be, because the way swearing seems to be everywhere isn't necessarily a sign of its strength, but actually a step towards death via oversaturation. So the offensiveness of swearing I see is really important to maintain if we're going to maintain having swear words. So I'd like to just take a little look forward to see like what's kind of happening in swearing research, what has happened and what I think is about to happen. So it's still really a young field. The scholarship of swearing can actually, despite its youth, be divided into different phases or terms. So starting in the 60s, research was focused on swear words, not really swearing, but just swear words, and positioned itself as confirming the use of swear words as offensive and non-standard. And then, towards the 2000s, research pivoted actually towards the benefits of swearing, which I'm going to talk about in, seminar number 3, and focused on swearing as social behavior and swearing as psychologically powerful. But currently, I predict, the pendulum is kind of swinging back to revisit swearing as inherently negative, recognizing that the benefits of swearing are only possible as long as swearing retains its inherent offensiveness. As long as swearing remains in the collective consciousness as a fundamentally bad behavior, then it can be strategically deployed for good purposes. Folk linguistics plays an important role in maintaining the offensiveness of swearing. And as long as swearing is offensive, it's powerful. So the next 2 seminars will deal with folk linguistics of swearing and the power of swearing. So I hope that you can join me on Friday and then join me again in 2 weeks and in 3 weeks.
So Friday we won't be here. So Friday will be in
3
something.
something.
Yeah, 10.
Okay. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll leave this out in case we need to go back to slides.
Yeah, I guess I have one other question, which is about the frequency, it would be interesting to compare, so to what extent these, swearing is sort of associated with emotional peaks and troughs of the day kind of thing. Because it's, if it's kind of like, I don't know, for instance, when I was in high school in the UK, there was a guy who was he would take the bus with me. And whenever the bus would, he had this habit of saying, like the bus would come and say, the fucking bus is coming, And it was kind of like, I mean, every day almost he would say this, right? It was kind of like completely, sort of like random sort of, I mean, the bus had done nothing to it. So, just kind of like, and so there's certain, I think there's also kind of, I mean, that is right, I suppose it's there's variation, I mean, I suppose this sort of goes back to something you were saying in terms of certain kind of classes or social groups where it's much more, particularly British working class, very, throwing in a lot of swear words, kind of really kind of like part of their identity. Like
Sure.
they have to do it. It's kind of like it has no correlate. Strong, but certainly there's pervasive use which is kind of independent of any of the related activity, as opposed to what I was asking whether it's correlated with if you have crises or for me swearing is mostly associated with my cycling.
Me too.
Okay.
I was just thinking that.
And throughout the years it's been that way.
Like if someone cuts you off or like that kind of, or,
This kind of things, yeah, well,
Yeah,
right, and for instance, I would miss, when I was cycling in California, for instance, I would never swear, because there was never, because the driving is so polite and everything, I would, and I miss the fact that, the cycling in Jerusalem where, I'd all the time be, not all the time, but, have quite a lot of aggro. So, anyway, yeah, so it seems to somehow I wonder what the time, to what extent one can tie in swearing to emotional episodes somehow.
So the study that I mentioned about using the autobiographical memory prompts, so many people, I can't pull out a percentage right now, but so many people reported swearing, either when something goes wrong or when they stub their toe. Such that we were 4 of us on this team, we were all wondering, are people stubbing their toes? Like I mean, there were so many people that were stubbing their toes. It used to be that it would be when you hit your thumb with a hammer. That example has somehow fallen out of like this kind of collective consciousness. But when something goes wrong or stubbing your toe, and I imagine when you're cycling and you're swearing probably to yourselves, or are you actually swearing at a driver? Are you swearing at a?
I'm swearing.
Oh, you're swearing at people. Oh,
And so
okay.
I'm very careful about what I
Okay.
say, so I've trained myself to say turkey,
Oh,
just
really?
in case they stop and want to engage physically.
Okay.
Because then I can tell them, I just accused you of being a dindon, you can't, I didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, how about you, do you
Yeah.
actually say real
No,
words?
but I usually swear in English, but it, usually English, but I once was sort of, I had my daughter on the back and I was relieved, and a kind of car sort of hit us, and then I started doing like something like that, and I did it wrong somehow, and my daughter found it really amusing, because it was kind of like, I don't know, maybe I said, vous êtes con, or something like that.
Oh,
It's
that's
really,
pretty funny, right,
it's,
with a polite pronoun, that's
Yeah.
hilarious, okay, that's very
Yeah.
funny,
But there was a study,
yeah, great.
which I think I'm showing in the third seminar, about a study done at a factory, looking at floor workers and also management. And the study was actually about whether management could use swearing in their management styles, if management could allow swearing among like the factory floor workers, or should have a policy for swearing, and found out that swearing was really beneficial for the factory workers. They used it to kind of mitigate their stress, but also found that like swearing increased to a certain point as they became more stressed because they had to meet deadlines and they had to, do stuff on the factory floor. But once things reached a point of like the highest point of stress, all swearing stopped and almost all communication became very telegraphic. But it was a sign that when your workers stop swearing, that's when things are kind of critical. And that you want to maybe jump in, but as long as they're swearing, they're handling the stress. So just kind of thinking like their workday, maybe, they, a lot of stress and then they swear a lot. And then if it gets too much, they stop swearing.
One thing, when you were talking about sort of it's being associated with certain parts of British society, I wondered to what extent they're actually filler words,
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. No,
right.
if that's exactly the case,
Yeah.
a lot of these kind of
It's
things,
just,
the fucking fuck,
Yeah.
there's this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's kind of like but it's still, it's a little bit more than a filler, because it is still, you're still getting your kind of macho kind of thing
yeah.
in some extent, but.
And there is something about the phonology of fuck and shit, which are, I don't know, in my world, the most common ones. I mean, think about how they're constructed. They're perfect, right? They end with the nice stop. They have kind of middling, not
Yeah.
very noticeable vowels.
Yeah.
They start off. I mean, they're pretty good, right? You can see what people are doing with their mouths when they're saying either of them, and that's what I think about when I'm on my bike and it's sort of people are looking through their rear view windows. It's sort of, they can see from your mouth what you're uttering. So there's something really perfect about the phonology of those two words. There. And then something you were saying about becoming, the desensitization. And one thing I noticed, I think it's maybe in the last 5 years that the New Yorker uses it. Very fucking appears everywhere in the New Yorker now, and it never did before. And so you
Fucking
almost,
is what?
it's reported speech, but not always. I mean, it's sort of the New Yorker magazine.
No, I mean, fucking as a gerund or as
As an adjective. Yeah.
Eat the fucking blah, blah.
Yeah, whereas they used to absolutely filter that out, and so just seeing something more frequently kind of reduces its value. But you'll be pleased if you have any Boy Scouts, American Boy Scouts in your own. They're all into, I am pure of body and of language, and so they always give big speeches about not swearing, so that'll maintain this part of the lexicon.
That's super interesting. No, I think it's really, really important. And it would be interesting. I'll present a study of a colleague of mine, of people complaining to the BBC. But I would be interested to know if anyone, has written in to complain to the New Yorker about, the language. If anyone reacts to those usages.
I mean, I still react when I see it,
Yeah.
but I've not written.
I actually react when the New York Times censors things, because I find that.
Okay.
Because,
Yeah.
they do all this kind of, they take out all the bad words, right? And I find that, in recorded speech, right?
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
ridiculous, because you'd like to know what they said, right? And it's kind of like, so they have all these euphemisms, but you use an off-color word, or you use
Yeah. Right.
extra slow, you, that's not the news. The news is, what happened, right? So it's better.
But it was really interesting, since kind of Trump entered into the political arena and he's had these problematic statements, it's been interesting to see how news outlets handle his speech. So, when he said grab him by the pussy and he talked about shithole countries, is to kind of look at newspapers. Do they print these words in full? Do they censor them? Some newspapers even had text about their language policy, that they want to represent the language as it was said, and so they're kind of veering away from their normal policies of censorship to really let people know exactly what was going on. So it does present kind of challenges for the public discourse.
By the way, though, with respect to driver reaction, they actually, the thing I find that gets the worst reaction is actually when I shake my head. I shake my head kind of disapprovingly, and it happens quite, they'll sort of stop and say, what's your problem? What did I do? This kind of thing, as if I kind of like, whereas it's rare that if I say something, it kind of.
Interesting. I find if you touch the car,
Oh,
they go, and
yeah.
if you caress the car, they lose it, they stop, and they actually come out and attack you.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah, this is another population you should be looking at.
Yeah, apparently.
No,
Apparently, yeah, that's what I'm missing.
For a long, a while back, I think I stopped recording now, so that